I heard you.
Can hear everything you say.
We can start now.
All right, then we'll just go ahead and get things started. I'd like to call the May 26th regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the City of Post Falls, to order, and we'll go ahead and start with roll call.
Stephenson,
Here.
Kimball,
Here.
Whalen,
Here.
Carey,
Here.
Davis,
Here. All right, we'll move on to the next item this evening, and that would be any amendments this evening to the agenda. Mr. Manley, Cafferty, anyone else? Any amendments?
I don't believe there is. I could ask Cafferty if he wants to keep the new business as it is.
Mr. Cafferty?
I don't see any reason to change the agenda, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we'll stay as is. Any ceremonies, announcements, appointments, and or presentations this evening? Hearing nothing from anyone, I will go ahead and take that as a no. And I'd ask for any declaration of conflict from the commissioners this evening.
None.
So for me, I do not have a conflict of interest, but there's a couple things I'd like to declare on the record. And this is regard to the North Place East project. So as a teenager, I had the opportunity to move pipes for the Schneidmillers, and a lot of that was out there in that vicinity on that field. I drove combine for them, work on their farm, etc. So I know the project very well, or the property anyway. But that doesn't really affect anything tonight. My decision will be based on the record, not on any prior knowledge. Also, my company does work for Greenstone in Washington on some of their Washington projects. Although this is technically a different company that is applying for tonight. I want to make sure that the record is clear that my company does not work on this project. We have no financial interest in it, nor do we expect to ever. And so because of that, there's no conflict of interest, and I feel that I can be impartial tonight with regards to this.
Okay.
And I have seen Mr. Kimball's, he and I emailed back on this topic, and I concur with his assessment of the situation. I don't believe he has a conflict based upon those facts and what the law is.
All right, that being said, that is duly noted, which brings us to the consent calendar and the action items within. Mr. Manley?
Yeah, item A is the meeting minutes from 5/12/2020. Item B is the vintage annexation, file number ANNX1/2020, reasoned decision. And item C is the Renly subdivision, file number SUBD 7/2020, reasoned decision.
Okay, I'm assuming most of this is fresh in everyone's minds, and the commissioners had a chance to go over that. So if there are no questions, I would look for a motion for the approval.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll move to approve the consent calendar as presented.
I'll second.
Okay, we've had a motion and a second. Roll call.
Whalen,
Aye.
Kimball,
Yes.
Carey,
Yes.
Stephenson,
Yes.
Davis,
Yes. All right, this brings us to the next item on the agenda for this evening, and that is citizen issues. Section of the agenda is reserved for citizens wishing to address the commission on issues that are not on this evening's agenda, nor are planned for future agendas. We ask that you would hold that until then. It says here written comment only. Amber, do we have any comment?
No.
Okay, seeing none, we'll go to number 3, which is unfinished and or old business. Mr. Manley, none there?
That would be correct.
All right, let's jump into the meat of the meeting this evening, and that would go right into the public hearing. We'll start off with the North Place East Subdivision and PUD, and we'll go ahead and open it up.
Okay, can you guys all see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So John Manley, planning manager here at the City of Post Falls, presenting the staff report for the North Place East Subdivision and PUD. Case file PUD 4 2020 and SUBD 6 2020. The owner is the Schneider Brothers Inc., with the applicant being Greenstone Kootenai 2. I would like to mention before I go into more details, there's 2 items, a subdivision and PUD. They're separate items. At the end of this public hearing, 2 separate motions, preferably the PUD first, as it sets the tone whether or not the subdivision would go forward or not. And then you'd have the motion on the subdivision. So the request is for PUD approval. Reason for PUD approvals is typical development standards aren't necessarily ideal for the applicant's vision for a project, so they want to have some sort of exceptions, and I'll go into those within this presentation. Also, to facilitate this, they want to subdivide 37 acres into 140 lots. Here's the project location. As you see here, it's east of Idaho Street, just north of the Fieldstone subdivision. Penrose is planned to extend to the east and connect to Hope Avenue sometime in the future. You see here that the current land use is agriculture. There's no significant topography or vegetation matters on the site. Proposed density is 3.8 units an acre gross. That's less than what's allowed in the R1. So the requests from the applicant are more design related rather than a density increase request for this PUD. The water provider and sewer would be the City of Post Falls. You look at the zoning, everything around the site is zoned R1, and they're planning an R1 type subdivision. Here's the proposed PUD plan. You see the connection to Idaho Street with Penrose running west to the east. You also see some internal local residential roads. The proposal for this PUD plan is for minimum lots to be reduced from 60 feet to 40 foot width. We do have some of those lots in Post Falls now. Maximum lot coverage is to increase from 40% to 50%. This is common because as you increase the lot size, sometimes the houses don't necessarily shrink. So in order to get a similar house on a smaller lot, applicants generally want to have an increase in lot coverage. Minimum lot area is reduced from 6,500 square feet to potentially a 4,000 square foot smaller lot. Staff reviewed this as far as this request, and you saw in one of the conditions that the drive approach and driveways within the rights of way shall be no wider than 40% of the lot width. So that allows for at least, not only do you provide the 2 on-street parking, it would be typical, the 2 off-street parking, so it'd be on-site for each residence. You should be able to get 1 vehicle on-street as well. Plus it ensures there's some space available for stormwater and garbage and mail deliveries. Typically you could go up in a standard R1 lot, potentially up to a 32-foot wide lot. So this just kind of hones that in there. Going into the criteria specifically, the proposed PUD provides adequate utility services and parking to service proposed development. So looking at this, the roads, and I'll go back to this map, all the roads are intended to meet standard city roads and local residential roads. So with that criteria, you should be able to, and I mentioned, provide parking to meet the requirements for that, plus provide utilities and services for the proposed PUD and subdivision. Proposed PUD provides an integrated transportation network that adequately serves the proposed development. The proposed development, if you look at the staff report, it would meet this criteria. The third PUD criteria means, does it provide enhanced community design by conserving and incorporating the site's natural, scenic, or historic features in the development? That's really not applicable on the site. There's no historic nature of it. Ray may have some historic moments there, but as far as like the site itself, it's more of just agricultural land that's planned for infill development within the city of Post Falls city limits. Integrating a mix of compatible land uses in development and adequately buffering or separating any incompatible uses in the development. Staff would review, even though these lots are planned to be smaller, but they're still single family home and would be completely compatible with the other R1 lots in the area. Locating the proposed uses and lot sizes in the PUD in a manner that blends the surrounding uses, neighborhoods, and public facilities. Once again, it kind of goes with the previous statement that this would be compatible and would blend in positively. The other one, provide at least 10% of gross land for open space. So when you look at these tracts, they are outside of the right of way. They meet the definition of open space for a PUD, and the sum of all those is greater than 10%. So this PUD would provide open space that would meet the PUD requirements. And then the fourth criteria is the proposed PUD provides for a timely development and property and a scrutiny for future security, for future completion and maintenance. They're planning a 3-phase approach with their subdivision. It appears as if that with the consumption of housing and lots, that we should be able to complete this in a fairly timely manner to get access and safe residential developments. Do you have any questions for me at this point regarding the PUD before I go into the subdivision criteria?
Is it going to open, this is Vicky Jo, is it going to have an exit right onto Idaho and in the first phase there?
Yeah, phase 1, as you see right where if you can see the hand, the cursor, that is where the ingress egress would be from Idaho Street into this development.
Quick question, what's the future for Prairie and Idaho? That corner, that intersection there, because that's a bad intersection.
For as far as road improvements?
Yeah, I mean, how far are we out to something being done there? I mean,
I would ask Rob Paulus is available to comment on that because he's been studying that more than I have for sure.
Robert, do you want to address that?
Thank you, Mr. Davis, members of the commission. The Post Falls Highway District has recently completed a design to put in a single lane roundabout at the intersection of Prairie Avenue and Idaho Street. They're online right now for looking at 2021 and possibly 2022 at the latest for construction of that. That's a safety improvement project that's got grant funding for it. So those issues should be addressed in the very near future.
thank you.
Any other questions for staff before we move into subdivision?
I would like to make one clarification. These boundary lines for these phases oftentimes shift a little bit. Like for example, I bet we're not going to get just a corner of that park in open space in phase 1, but generally speaking, this would be kind of the bounds. So going into the subdivision review criteria, we'd look at the first one, can it be served by water and can it be certain quantity and quality? So in the staff report, you read that this is possible. Staff cited that as being feasible, so it would meet that criteria. Criteria 2, similarly, sewage or sewer system can be supplied to this proposed subdivision. Proposed streets are consistent with the transportation elements in the comprehensive plan. You did see in the staff report some in-depth analysis of the proposed streets. I'm going to move this over. I'm hoping that it works. These conditions that staff did add, internal, you guys can read this for the subdivision. Even though the streets meet the city standards, wanted to make some added clarifications on condition 8 for that. All areas of the proposed subdivision which may involve soil or topographical conditions presenting hazards have been identified. There's really none on this site. The fifth one here, does it conform with zoning? The lots would only conform with PUD approval. That's why that motion would be done first, is find out if the PUD is approved, then this subdivision would meet the PUD. As stated, typical R1 subdivision lots are 6,500 square feet. The sixth one deals with, just to kind of summarize all this text, is development paying for its fair share. This is done with single family development, typically at a time of building permits through impact fees that are assessed that go to parks, streets, and public safety. Agencies routed, here's a list you see here. You don't see TDS on that, but they were also routed. We heard back from Post Falls Police Department and Kootenai County Fire. They were both neutral on the proposal. So that kind of sums up the subdivision part. I'd stand for any other questions on either topic at this point in time.
I've got a quick question that's probably directed more towards Rob with regards to the, I think it's condition 8 and the cross sections. Is there a reason a 65-foot cross section won't accommodate the required city improvements for Penrose when it's adjacent to tract C on the north?
So, Mr. Kimball, city staff took a look at that and we discussed it with Greenstone as well, and they can talk about that during their portion. The city's minimum standard for a major collector roadway, which Penrose is slated to be, is 75 feet of right-of-way. We were looking, and from our view of the large area of land and our long-term anticipated traffic volumes, we wanted to keep the flexibility that if in the long term we did need to expand Penrose to a wider road, we had that ability and wouldn't be constrained by 65 feet of right-of-way.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, a question. So the only out in this first phase is going to be to Idaho Street. When will, or that's what it appears, is that correct?
That would be correct. Phase 1, 2, we'll go back to the phasing plan here. So you can see phase 1, 2, and 3, that they're out will be Idaho until there's another connection at some future date to either Syringa to the east or Greens Ferry.
And do we have any idea when those additional portions will be built out?
That would be a question probably for the applicant to communicate their development timing plans.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for staff before we move on?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay.
John, in the staff report, it says Idaho Street will be built out to 3 lanes. Where is that going to be built out from, to and from?
Once again, I'd probably have Mr. Paulus comment on that.
Commissioner Stephenson, Robert Paulus, Assistant City Engineer. So with phase 1, they would be responsible for widening Idaho Street from their southern boundary to the northern limits of phase 1, where John has that hand right now.
Okay.
Is that 2 lanes each way then?
A 3-lane section is one travel lane.
One
in the
each and one
southbound
turn.
direction, one in the northbound direction. And then you'd end up with a center turn lane to get onto Penrose from the north or the south.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none, then we will move on to the applicant. Did I see Mr. Kevin Schneidmiller here?
Yes, good evening to the chairman and members of the Planning Commission. Appreciate the opportunity to come before you tonight. As much as I would like to, I will not comment on Mr. Kimball's employment as a youth with us. So I'll take the high road and let that one go tonight.
Duly noted.
So again, we are here to present the North Place preliminary subdivision and PUD request. I'm representing Greenstone Kootenai to the applicant as well as the owner, Schneidmiller Brothers, Inc. Again, you can see the aerial, and I just wanted to share a little bit. The red area is the project we're bringing before you tonight. I just wanted to comment a little bit about Schneidmiller Brothers, Inc. Own the balance of the green, which is bordered by Prairie Avenue to the north, and it does not extend quite all the way to Greens Ferry. And our southern boundary is the Fieldstone subdivision. We had intended originally, as the city adopted the mixed use zone, to bring forward this entire project and get a zone change and then bring it forward under the mixed use zone. As we worked with staff over the last several months, it became evident that probably some of the design standards and parameters were going to take a little longer than fit our timeline. So we decided in discussions with staff that we would bring forward a preliminary subdivision, which you see tonight. As we've done some internal master planning, and over the next several months, as we start to bring forward a rezone of the balance of the property, we'll be sharing that with staff. But this area that we're bringing tonight is an area that was always intended to be a single family detached home in what I would call a rather traditional size lots and so forth, the majority of them. So that's the reason we went the route that we're going and proposing tonight. Again, Mr. Manley has shared this with you. Just want to point out a couple of items. Again, is pretty consistent with all of our communities as we master plan them. We'll have some open space at the entryways associated with trails and so forth. And then in this case, we're showing what we would call a small neighborhood pocket park that will be associated with these first 140 lots. Again, the next item is the phasing map, and we've been very, very consistent in what we've shared with staff over the last 20 years that we've worked in the city of Post Falls, and phasing plans, especially as you get larger. Obviously, this is only proposed to be 3 phases. A lot of times are not very accurate when you get beyond the first phase. Obviously, some of it's market driven. But one of the things I wanted to point out is exactly what Mr. Manley stated. We would never do a first phase that would look like it does. My plans would be to bring forward the first subdivision phase that would include all of the small neighborhood pocket park, so it could be developed as part of the first phase. So while our engineer, as he prepared the phasing, he kind of looks at it more along the lines of dividing it into kind of 3 equal phases. And you know, we concur with that and appreciate that, but we would not, either the park will be left entirely out to the second phase or will be included entirely in the first phase. Again, our objective is to create single family lots within an area that's currently zoned R1 and is in concurrence with the comprehensive plan. Again, I already stated that because of the mixed use and some of the design parameters associated with that, we determined that to move forward, we needed to go down the more traditional subdivision with a PUD. Really won't touch on anything here other than we are requesting through the PUD variance lots with frontages down to 40 feet. And when I discuss the PUD variances, I'll go into that in more detail. So in along the lines of the PUD and the variances, I went back and looked at when we first proposed Montrose back in the mid 90s. And I looked at how many variances we had to request at that time, and they included a lot with street sections and so forth. And what we find now is the city had revised their code regarding a lot of those type of issues and really match up with what we had proposed back in the day. So we view that as a very positive thing. And so we really don't have a lot of items that we're proposing to vary from the standard code. The first one, as Mr. Manley pointed out, is being to reduce lot frontages from 60 feet to 40 feet. I would tell you that we would never, with detached houses in our community, look at a 40-foot front-loaded home. We just don't think you can get a nice street look and really have a good street appeal from a community standpoint. If we do any 40-foot frontages, they will be alley loaded, and we would work with staff to incorporate alleys. Not even 100% sure we would do that in these first 3 phases, but we have some very nice product that looks wonderful from the street and does fit on 40-foot wide lots, but we do all of those as alley loaded with the garages in the back. And we have not done any of those in our Montrose community, but we look forward to in the future doing those. They're very well received in other places we do business. And so I think it's something we definitely want to start adding to our projects in Post Falls and certainly in North Place. It's just going to be a matter of timing. But I wanted to emphasize that, again, we would, on 40-foot frontages, they would be alley loaded, not front loaded. Increasing the maximum lot coverage from 40% to 50%, just as Mr. Manley stated, as lots change in sizing and we're seeing a larger demand for ranchers. But with those ranchers, very often people want 3-car garages, they want covered back patios. And so the building side of our company has been running into more and more issues with 40% lot coverage. And that is not unique to the city of Post Falls by any means. We run into it in other cities that we do business in. So obviously you still have the setback requirements, front yard, rear yard, side yard. So you can't, you're not changing those. So our experience has been, it does not affect the feel of the community or the view from the streetscape. So we are requesting an increase to 50%. And the last one is a reduction in the lot area from 6,500 to 4,000 square feet. And that kind of goes in conjunction with our request for 40 foot lot frontages through the PUD process. Again, we believe our proposal is consistent with the goals, objectives of the comprehensive plan. It provides off-site and on-site improvements to meet the city transportation master plan, that being the improvements to half of Idaho Street and to Penrose, which is a collector, proposed collector running east and west. And as you can see by the diagrams that have been shown, Penrose will somewhat meander through the project. You can see it curves northerly and then will turn back to the south. It actually, not on this project, but as we develop out the entire 280 acres, we'll exit the project at the southeast corner. And then there's about 600 feet before you get to Greens Ferry that we don't control, but I believe there's right-of-way designated there. So we very well, most of the time, do not develop our master plans on kind of a grid type. We like to meander the streets a little bit more. That's why you see this kind of the starting of the shape of it as it goes forward. Sewer and water is available. It will be picked up on at Syringa. And one thing, one of the commissioners asked the question, and I'm not sure the answer was totally accurate, so I want to make sure we clarify that. There are 3 phases, and obviously in meetings with the fire department and the International Fire Code is pretty clear that when you exceed 30 lots, you need to perfect a second access. And we have worked with the fire department. Edgewater, which is the southernmost east-west street, and that's where we'll be bringing sewer and water in from Syringa. When we get to a point of needing the second access, then we will perfect that out to Syringa, going southerly into the Fieldstone subdivision. So the one access on Idaho will not serve all 3 phases. It will follow the pretty typical International Fire Code that says when you exceed 30 lots, you need to provide a second access. So very likely that's where the plan we have, and that's how that'll be accomplished. Finally, I believe Mr. Kimball asked the question about the right-of-way, and it's in the staff report that we had proposed a 65-foot right-of-way on Penrose for really the very reason that I think Mr. Kimball was alluding to. You can make the street section and associated improvements work in the 65-foot right-of-way. We had a good conversation with city staff. Mr. Paul has pointed out the reasoning for requesting a 75-foot right-of-way, and we understand that, and we concur with that. So we do not have any issues with any of the staff proposed conditions that are in their report. We feel very comfortable with all of them. I do want to point out that we appreciate staff has worked long and hard with us through some issues, not only related to this, but to the bigger picture of the property. And as is always the case, we feel we've come to very good conclusions that work for everybody and will be a benefit long-term to everybody. So we appreciate your consideration of this request, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Schneidmiller?
No.
I have a quick one.
Okay.
Will that change the expansion of the right-of-way and associated reduction in the area of track C, put you below the 10% for open space?
No, we'll still be above the 10%. So.
Okay. That's all I had.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Schneidmiller. Amber, open this time up for public comment. Do we have any in favor?
None.
Do we have any neutral?
None.
Do we have any in opposition?
None.
Okay, so there would be no need for any type of rebuttal. So I would turn it over to the commissioners. Commissioners, before we close this out, do we have any other questions for applicant, staff, anyone before we move on? Okay, hearing none, then we'll go ahead and close this public hearing. And remember, we are looking for two motions. We're going to start with the PUD as our first motion, and whether that's approval or denial, and that'll lead us to the subdivision piece. So at this point, I would open it up for comment. Any commissioners, any comment, any thoughts? Mr. Stephenson?
I think it makes sense. I mean, it's that whole area is just open field right now. It's just going to gradually fill in all of the prairie. Hopefully whatever is developed north of this development will also be required to make Idaho a 3-lane all the way through. And then I think that roundabout will definitely help whenever that gets developed. I think it makes sense for that area of the city.
Commissioner Whalen?
I agree. I think I've seen greenstone developments in the past. I think that they are well done and well planned. I think it is all good.
Fantastic. Commissioner Carey, anything to add?
No, I like the development, and I think there is a call for some smaller lot areas, still have the single family, but not have the big yards and stuff to have to maintain. My only issue is that's a lot of, even though there's doing some development or some improvements on Idaho, it's a very short span that's being improved right now. And that's putting a lot of traffic on Idaho, which is a pain, our street right there as it is now. And it'll be a while before the roundabout is put in. So that would be my only concern, is that it's a lot of increased traffic that basically is going to go onto Idaho Street one way or the other.
Okay. Mr. Kimball?
So I think this is probably a great example of another greenstone development that, you know, follows a very specific plan. They've got some great open space at the entrance. They meet the requirements of the subdivision ordinance and the PUD ordinance. And Vicky Jo, I appreciate your comments with regards to traffic. And one thing we should probably remember, I think Rob said that construction was 2021 or 2022, which is 2 years from now. And best case scenario is I wouldn't expect the first house to get built and lived in until 21 or 22, just given the time frames that involved. So that's probably going to marry up pretty well. But I feel comfortable with that. That's a good thing for us.
Thank you, Ray.
Community. And then really, I guess I just had a question for Mr. Cafferty with regards to the motion and the conditions. They seem part and parcel. They're all the conditions are subdivision and PUD conditions. There were two different motions. We would be adopting the conditions for both or one, or what's appropriate there?
I believe, and Mr. Manley will correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe it was drafted up so as the conditions would apply to both equally. So the same conditions would apply to the PUD as to the subdivision. It's a bit redundant, but it captures them both because they're, like you stated, they're kind of intertwined. So you don't get the subdivision if you don't get the PUD.
Okay, then that being said, I would look for a motion for the PUD at this time.
I'll do it. I'll move to recommend approval of the North Place East subdivision, PUD, excuse me, 0004-2020, and recommend approval and adopting the facts and findings and conclusions contained in the staff report.
would second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a
Conditions?
second. Mr.
I'll
Cafferty?
second. Oh.
I
Do
wasn't
we have
sure.
to,
Mr. Stephenson's motion also included adopting the recommended conditions with that.
Correct. Yes, everyone's shaking their head. So we are there. So Mr. Stephenson did indeed. Commissioner Whalen seconded it. And at this point, we would take it to vote. Amber?
Carrie,
yes,
Stephenson,
Yes.
Kimball,
Yes.
Whalen. Whalen,
That was yes.
thank you. Davis,
Did we lose Amber?
Davis,
Yes.
that's it. I think I
Did we
got
get
everybody.
Did we get everybody?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Whalen is yes.
I was going to say,
Oh.
I'm looking at you, Laura. You're up in the left-hand corner of my screen. I wanted to make sure. So, okay, unanimous yes on the PUD, which would take us to the second piece of that, and that would be the consideration of approval of the subdivision. Looking for a motion there.
I'll try that one. I move to approve the North Place East subdivision, SUBD 0006 -2020, subject to the findings and conclusions, PUD and subdivision conditions within the staff report.
That,
Okay, we had some garbled seconds, but they were absolutely there. So we have a motion, a second, call for vote.
Whalen,
Yes.
Stephenson,
Yes.
Carrie,
Yes,
Kimball,
yes.
Davis.
Yes. All right, let's move on to our next public hearing this evening, and that is the Simmons Zone Change, file number RZNE 0003-2020. Mr. Manley, are you presenting there as well? Fantastic. Unmute and take it away, sir.
So yes, the Simmons zone change, case file RZNE 3/2020. The applicant is Rand Wickman and the owner is Robert and Joy Simon. Their request is to rezone approximately 0.3 acres from the single-family R1 zoning to the requested high-density multifamily R3 zoning district. The site is currently a vacant, undeveloped piece of land in Post Falls. The site location is, as you see here in the hatched red box area, a bit northwest, 1 block northwest from the intersection of Mullen Avenue and Idaho. Current land use, as I stated, vacant. There's no significant topology or vegetation matters. Water and sewer is provided by the city of Post Falls. Looking at the zone change criteria for this proposal, amendments of the zoning map, and I'm actually going to read all three of these here because and go over them. They all have basically the same context. So is it consistent with the future land use map? Is it consistent with the goals and policies in the comprehensive plan? Is it consistent with street classifications, traffic patterns, existing development, future land use, community plans, geographic or natural features? And does it encourage a balance of land uses in Post Falls to be stable, desirable, and a sustainable community? Looking at the zoning aspect of the proposal, you see that here's the Idaho and Mullen Avenue intersection. Orange on the map that you see here is high density multifamily, and the yellow in this picture is R1. So it goes from commercial south of Mullen Avenue to multifamily R3, then to R1. There's kind of an abrupt transition there from R3 to R1. Oftentimes what you see in planning is a little bit more of a a transition from R3, R2 to R1. So this brings up, and I mentioned in the staff report a little bit, that the proposal is pretty close to some pretty highly classified roadways, being Mullen Avenue in Idaho. So in some aspects, there's merit for it being higher density, but it is adjacent to some R1 too. Looking at the future land use map, you see the residential designation all north of Mullen Avenue, so it'd be consistent with the future land use map. Traffic patterns, none was cited in the staff report complicating the request. Existing development, I kind of mentioned that in the previous slide about single family nearby. There's some duplexes nearby that area. There's some fourplexes on Mullen Avenue. So there's some transitioning going on at that location. Where that occurs, that's why we're here tonight, is to kind of go over that, to see where you guys as a board feel on those matters. There's no specific community plans on this area, nor is there any geographic or natural features worth mentioning. Going to the other three criteria, commercial and high density residential zoning is typically assigned along streets with higher road classification. So the proposed project isn't along Idaho nor Mullen Avenue, but it is in close proximity. So it does warrant potentially some transitioning in land uses and development at that location. Limited neighborhood commercial and lower density residential zoning is typically assigned for properties as they proceed further away from an urban node. So from a planning's perspective, this is a pretty active urban node within development, and it's transitioning quite rapidly from high density to single family. You would typically see more of a slower progression on that to preserve some of the light, noise, and air pollution that occurs along those busy corridors from getting into single family neighborhoods. And the last criteria is dealing with industrial zoning, and that's not applicable at this request. See the agencies routed. We didn't receive any comments. So I'd stand from any questions you have for staff regarding this proposal, or what was presented tonight, or was in the staff report.
I have a quick question for you, John.
What's that?
Can you go back to the aerial and show me the closest multifamily development that's not like a duplex?
I believe that's a duplex. It may not be on this area. I believe it's near Brigger, south of Mullen Avenue.
Okay, so it's on the other side of Mullen then.
Yeah, I think there's at this location, I believe there's a couple duplexes, or I know there's at this location some multifamily activity there. This here is a duplex at that location.
Okay.
But multifamily is zoned on those adjacent properties, right?
Yeah, multifamily zoning everywhere south of 9th Avenue. So anybody in this location, if they wanted to, would have vested rights to tear down their house or duplex and build at 18 dwelling units per acre.
Sure. I'm just trying to the neighborhood character.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Manley, and being new at this, does Post Falls have a definition for a spot zone?
Spot zoning at this location, R3 at this wouldn't be. In order for it to be spot zoning, it would have to be not consistent with the goals and policies in the comp plan, or the future land use map. So you'd have to be making kind of an erroneous decision on zoning that was inconsistent with your future land use planning.
Thank you.
And Mr. Manley, again, for clarification, I know that when we're dealing with multifamily, we like to try to keep it in a heavier density area, for instance, as far as traffic. So just to confirm, we're looking at 400 feet from North Idaho Street, relatively close to Super One Foods, within walking distance of Celti's and Idaho intersection. And there is a bus stop in addition to Mullen and Idaho. So that is all close proximity.
Yeah, and correct. And the reason why for some of those policies is oftentimes when you get into multifamily, you end up with individuals that are more reliant on public systems and commercial services for their daily needs. And
Right.
so hence we have comp plan policies to reinforce that. And so, and it kind of goes hand in hand with these two policies you see here. You have, you know, as you get closer, we want the higher density near those higher road class. As you get further away, most of those individuals have cars or are reliant on vehicular traffic. So that goes hand in hand with that second policy that you see on the screen.
Any other questions for staff? No? Mr. Manley, anything else?
No, nothing more to add.
Okay, if that's the case, thank you very much. And we will turn the time over to applicant, Mr. Rand Wickham.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and share the screen here, if I might. Bear with me. Okay. Beginning. Well, I'm not sure if that's doing what it's supposed to here, so. There we go. Again, Rand Wickman for the record. Thank you, Chairman, and planning commissioners and staff. I'm happy to be here representing my client tonight on this case. I think staff has done a good job summarizing the situation. Basically, we have two platted parcels here, lots 11 and 12, as you can see on the screen. That represents about 3/10 of an acre. So this is not a big development. This is not a big rezone, a little over 13,000 square feet. They are under one parcel number right now, but they could be segregated into the two separate platted parcels just by filing a seg request in the assessor's office. You can see from the photo, the site is flat. It's very well kept. And got a few trees on there. It's one of the very few, there aren't any other vacant lots, at least from my reconnaissance in the neighborhood there. So it's one of the few left in this area. The purpose for this request tonight is that, you know, without the zone change, you know, the owners could build a single family residence on each of those two lots. One's 50 feet wide, one's 60 feet wide. Frankly, I'm not real wild about that. Just because I think you end up with small homes there, and you know, they're fine in the right kind of neighborhood where you've got that kind of density. But I think if you have the zone change, it allows for greater flexibility in the site design. It gives the owners the possibility of doing a duplex or a triplex, perhaps. I think a fourplex, while it's permittable under the zoning, under R3 zoning, I think that gets pretty busy on this site. It would take a pretty inspired design to make a fourplex actually even fit. And so I think that's probably unlikely. And so we're likely to see a duplex or a 3-unit triplex kind of development here. And so, you know, what that means is really it's either the same number of units as with a duplex, or it's probably one extra. Maybe it's 2 extra, but that's got to be somebody that's a far better designer than me. Not that that's a high bar, of course. I don't consider myself a designer. Surrounding zoning, as you can see, you know, really we're looking here to get similar treatment for a similar situation. You see the other three corners at the same intersection are all zoned R3. That's really what we're looking for here. This property is similarly situated to those, and we feel like it'd be appropriate to have R3 zoning there. As Mr. Manley had indicated, we've got minor arterials here at Idaho Street and on Mullen. And again, we don't see this kind of zoning going beyond this property because everything to the north and west is pretty well all developed already. I'll just touch on, I guess, a couple points here on the criteria for rezoning. John went through this well. It's in the staff report and in my narrative, how we comply with the future land use map and the comp plan goals. John talked about the streets and traffic. Again, we're walking distance to the items that you may want to walk to, the grocery store, the bus stop, and so on. Existing development, I would back up. I think it was Commissioner Kimball indicated a question about other multifamily development. These two, Mr. Manuel is correct. This is a duplex right here, if you can see my pointer there. But down here, these are two triplexes. And so there's 6 units down here in 2 different buildings, just 2 lots removed to the south. And so again, I think it's, there is some multifamily available, or in the neighborhood here. And in our case, I think it, again, it provides us with a little greater flexibility in what we can do on this site. Just in closing out with the criteria there, I think we comply with all the criteria. It seems pretty straightforward to me, and unless you have questions for me, I don't really have anything else to add. We think it makes sense here, and we would appreciate a favorable decision.
Questions at this time for the applicant?
I have a quick one, I think.
Okay.
Mr. Wickman, would you be able to, would the owner be able to get their plan done with an R2 zoning?
I think they don't have I would say that they're looking for flexibility in their plans at this point. I don't believe they've got a firm plan that, hey, this is exactly what we want to do. The R2 zoning, we didn't go there simply because there's no other R2 in the neighborhood here. The R2 would allow for the duplex, and that sort of thing. And so it probably gets us where we need to be. The concern is it becomes more like a spot zone in that regard because it's not contiguous to other R2 zoning. And so that's why we didn't pursue that initially.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Wickham?
So Mr. Wickham, just to clarify, so there's one, it looks right directly to the south, and then another unit south of that one that are zoned there's a lot of R3 zoning, but they're the only unit that's right across the street is the one that is using the R3 zoning. The rest of them are not using this, or they're single family, even though they're zoned R3.
Correct. You've got the property directly across the street to the south that's duplex, which would not be permittable in the R1 zone. And then you've got just south of that, you've got the 2 3-plexes. So those are the only ones in the neighborhood that I'm aware of that are using their R3 zoning.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Wickman, thank you, sir. At this time, we would go ahead and move Amber. Do we have anyone that wishes to speak or comment in favor?
None in favor?
Do we have any that is neutral?
None.
Do we have any opposed?
We do have one opposed, Philip Matson.
Okay, and I see Philip Matson is on.
Hello.
Mr. Matson, if you'd state your name and address, and you have 4 minutes, sir.
Okay. Philip Matson, 906 North Brigger Street. It's the house directly across from the empty.
Thank you.
Okay. May I start?
Yes, sir, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes, by all means.
Yeah, we moved here in 2018 and we wanted a home with R1. We knew that ours was R3, but all the homes, like Laura mentioned, they're all R3. I mean, all R3, but they're single family homes. So I've written a report, which I'm basically reading. I'll kind of speed read it. So we confirmed that it was R1 across the street from our house, and we wanted a good retirement home and a place for my small clock shop business. R3 isn't clearly defined. It's kind of an open lot, so they could build 2 triplexes like down the street, or a duplex, which nobody's really opposed to duplexes. Skipping down to the petition, I have a petition that I submitted. Amber has it. 18 property owners have signed it. They're all diametrically opposed to R3 zoning on that lot because they don't want triplexes or multi-unit family units. No one was opposed to a duplex or a larger home or one triplex. The R3 zoning, the only one that presents a problem is the 2 triplexes down on the corner of Mullen and Brigger. And they present a parking problem. You see right there, there's cars parked on the street. There's usually 2 or 3 or 4, in addition to the parking that they have. And it has it has given problems in the winter to the neighbors directly to the north of them in the red house, in taking their garbage out in the winter and parking and so on. Then it's created a nuisance. Right now, we're not having an issue, but over the last 2 years, I got a police report, and there were 13 calls to those 2 residences. 3 of them drug related, 4 of them were malicious injury or domestic disputes and miscellaneous ones. So it kind of brings problems, is what happened, parking problems and then people problems. And we were concerned about property values. Everybody that signed the petition was concerned about property values. And there was nobody that I talked to that did not sign the petition or agreed with it. In a nutshell, Post Falls doesn't need another small apartment or triplex set up like down on the corner of Mullen and Knight. Just look across the street from Yokes and either way on Prairie Avenue.
Mr. Matson, sorry, you have about 1 minute left.
Okay, good. I'm kind of speed reading it. And so I suggest that we work together to make this a positive step and keep Post Falls a more desirable place for future generations. So R1, R2, or limited R3 would be fine, but we're against multi-unit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mattson, and your petition and comments were in our packet and were reviewed, so you're aware of that. Thank you. Amber, anything else?
None.
Okay. Mr. Wickman, do you want to speak to any of those things?
Yeah, I just very briefly, I guess, Chairman, thank you. You know, we're certainly sympathetic to the situation that, you know, bad neighbors can cause. You know, and I don't know how to prevent that, frankly. But you know, the owners certainly want to do a great job with this development. This, you know, this is an investment property for them. This is not a cut and run kind of situation. I believe they, you know, they intend to develop a rental unit there of some sort and would hold it long term. And you can see from the condition of the property right now, it's spotless. You know, I believe they would continue to do a good job of properly managing and maintaining it. And again, if R2 was a viable option for the commission, I don't think we're necessarily opposed to that, because it gets us to where we need to be, gets us the additional options, the additional design options that we'd like to have. And again, we're only talking, it's some design flexibility and an additional unit or two is really about all we're talking about here. So again, if commissioners have any questions of me, I'm happy to address them. Otherwise, thank you for your time.
I'm going to interject just for a brief moment. We do have one more
Okay.
in opposition. Carol Hudson.
Okay. All right, Carol, again, if you could just state your name and your address, and you have 4 minutes.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. We can hear you loud and clear.
All right, thank you. So I live across the street and I, yes, was not happy that my property is zone 3, but it's one house on 2 lots, which gives us space. And I'm in total agreement with what Phil was talking about, is that my behind me neighbors are off of the alley, oftentimes have been less than desirable. It has created congestion as far as the parking, cars left there with jacks underneath them. Also in the neighborhood, we do have meth houses, which has not been good. But in this particular case, the land would be better suited for either single family, one home on a double lot like ours, or at the most a duplex. What we do not want, absolutely, is something that is 2 stories. That will ruin the entire neighborhood and the feel of that neighborhood. If you walk or drive down that area, you will see single homes sitting in the middle of their property and not something that ends up being high rise. That's basically all I'd like to say, is that I am 100% against having it zone 3.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Cafferty, can we open it back up to Mr. Wickman if he has anything else to add? Anything else to add, or have you covered your bases?
I feel like I've said enough. Thank you, Chairman. Yep, I think we're good.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Commissioners, any questions for the applicant, for staff at this time?
I do have a question. I think it'll be for John.
Okay.
John, if we went with an R2 on here, what could be built on an R2 that couldn't be built on an R3, or, what's the difference there?
Oh, sorry, I need to share my screen. So I pull up the Vulcan placement table here. You guys see that?
Yep.
So the big difference between the R3 and the R2, R3 allows townhomes. The R2 allows only twin homes. You can't do townhomes, so that limits it a little bit. They both can do some multifamily. Here, what you see though is a denominator value of how much you can yield per square foot of land. And so in looking at the R2, you could still attain at 3,000 square foot a unit. More than likely, you could still attain a fourplex in that. Nothing more though, without doing, that would probably be your max you could do in the R2. You could still do a duplex at 3,600 square foot a unit. They have that covered for duplex. So there's not a whole lot different between the two, other than probably a unit, because I did my rough calculations. I think you could probably only yield about 5 units in the R3.
Okay.
Just because I'm curious, Mr. Manley, what is a townhome defined as under our code?
A townhome is a single family home on a common wall. So a townhome would have, you could have 3, 4, 5, 6 unit townhomes with common walls. A twin home is a 2-unit structure with 1 common wall. So a twin home is similar to a townhome. It's just you don't have multiple units attached. Did that answer what you're looking for?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Mr. Manley, I think the other big difference would be that the R3 allows 45 feet in height and the R2 is 35.
Yeah, right. Thanks for pointing that out. That would be one big difference, that R2 would treat the height no different than any other single family home.
Okay. I have a quick question for Mr. Cafferty. This request is for R3. And it's a zone change request. Do we have is it just a yes or no answer from us, or is it a recommendation for what we think would be appropriate?
It would be a recommendation. The final decision is up to the city council. If you were to recommend approval or denial, you don't have the ability to put conditions on zoning, as you're probably well aware. However, with any denial, there's always the requirement under Idaho code that you advise the applicant what action they can take to gain approval. So there's that. Does that help answer your question?
No.
So, Mr. Cafferty, in essence, what you're saying is that if the commission felt that this would be a better fit in R2, we would move for denial of the zone change, and in our notes say we feel that it's better suited to be R2 and send that to council. Is that what you're saying?
That would be one option that you could do, yes. And the final decision is up to the city council.
Okay. Any other?
Another alternative, I guess, as I'm thinking about it, there's also the possibility you could recommend a zoning development agreement or something like that as another option, something else they could consider.
Okay. Any other questions for staff? Let's have some commissioner comments then. Ray, why don't you start?
So this is a little bit of an interesting one. I feel that having in R3 next to R1, there are many places where that can be appropriate. I prefer to try to, or I like to see them buffered in a way, so to speak. I think across the street is a great buffer. Not necessarily yard to yard. When a 3-story building could be next to a single-story house, that doesn't necessarily always fit in with the character of the neighborhood, so to speak. There are mitigating circumstances where it can work well, where you limit the height to a 2-story building, so that would match with what would be allowed in the adjacent, in an R1 zone. And in most of our zone changes that we've done for R3 recently, or special use permits, they've all been on pretty much on a collector. They've had a driveway or a access point that comes out onto a collector street or an arterial. And although this is close to them, it doesn't necessarily really meet that criteria. I would think that an R2 is probably more appropriate and provides for a transition in zoning from an R1 to the R3, where right now we have that transition across the street right of way, but we don't necessarily, we wouldn't have that if we were to approve the zone change as requested. I don't know. It's I can see both sides of this coin. I don't think this is as clear cut as a lot of them I've seen. Anyway.
Commissioner Carey?
I have to agree with Ray. I think that's too dense. That you have too broad of a way you can go with the R3 zoning there, with single family surrounding it pretty much, and all the way to the north right now and to the west of the property. So I think I could go with an R2, but I don't think R3 is appropriate right now in that area.
Commissioner Whalen?
Thank you, Chair. I look at the neighborhood and what's zoned R3 and zoned R1, and I understand that the R3 zoning, people are using it as R1, but it's all across the street. Contiguous to this lot is all R1. The rest is separated by street. I do appreciate Mr. Wickman's sharing with us that the owners, the Simons, are really looking to do a duplex, maybe a tri. And if that would fit in R2 zoning, just to assure that a townhome wasn't built there in the future, I think that would be more palatable.
Commissioner Stephenson?
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. I could get behind an R2. I think it does limit what could be built on there as far as height and how big it could be. And my hope would be that it would be a good compromise between the developers and the residents that live in that area, and hopefully make everybody happy. We can put some limitations on it.
Mr. Cafferty, anything to interject before I entertain a motion?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think you've addressed it well. Except I didn't hear your comments.
My comments have to go back to the notes that I pulled with compatibility and existing development for future use. It says, in review of the compatibility to existing development and future use, either the existing single-family resident R1 or the proposed high-density multifamily R3 zoning is incompatible with the existing use. So I am probably a little less opposed to R3 than the rest of you, but I do understand the concerns that, they don't want a fourplex. But again, I go back to the owners and the abilities and the rights that they do have. So I'm a little bit torn. That being said, I will turn it over to you guys if someone would like to make a motion at this time.
I'm scrolling. I'll make a motion. Give me a second here. I would move to recommend denial of the Simon Zone Change Case File RNZ-0003-2020, finding that the requested zoning is not in conformance with the comprehensive plan with regards to street classification, existing development patterns in that block. And I would also state that, as mentioned in the record in our discussions, that I think that an R2 would be palatable in that vicinity or on that lot as a transition from the R3 to the R1 to further talk about the comprehensive plan and transition from R3 to R1. And Mr. Cafferty, does that have enough legs for your?
Yeah, that explains the basis for the denial and the actions that the applicant could take to potentially gain approval if it were to come back. Gives them some guidance without guaranteeing an outcome.
Okay.
So Commissioner Kimball's made a motion. We'd look for a second at this time.
I second.
Motion and a second. Call for vote.
Whalen,
Yes.
Stephenson,
Yes.
Carey,
Yes.
Kimball,
Yes.
Davis.
Yes. Okay. That will wrap up our public hearings for this evening and take us into line item number 5, which is new business. I believe we have a North Shore District subdivision and PUD to discuss.
We do, Mr. Chairman. So, as some of you may recall, we had planned to have a hearing on the North Shore Subdivision and PUD this evening. However, some circumstances came to light that there were some issues with the submittals on that subdivision, which warrants further action. At the time the agenda was being prepared and provided to the commissioners, it was my intention to recommend that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend or potentially require the applicant and the adjoining property owners to engage in mediation as is allowed within your powers under state law and under the city code. However, after the agenda went out, some additional factors came to light, which it's my belief will require some changes to the layout of the subdivision, which may impact the position of the parties on that. And so it seems premature at this time to encourage them to go forward with trying to resolve their differences until it becomes more clear what those differences may be after some changes are made. Does that make sense at all?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we will see this again someday in the foreseeable future, but I can't tell you when at this time. So thank you for your indulgence.
All right.
Mr. Cafferty, I see that on our agenda as an action item. Do we need to take action, like as into table?
No, not at this time, because I had requested that be placed on there as an action item when I was anticipating having the council potentially vote on whether or not to require the parties to engage in mediation. Since that time, it seems premature to require mediation, and so there's no action necessary at this time.
Okay, so there'll just be another public hearing notice at some point in time in the future.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. So at this point, no action will be our action. And that'll take us to number 6, administrative and staff reports. Mr. Manley, Mr. Paulus, anything to add?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Commissioner comments, anything for the good of the order? Tidbits, wisdom, anything? No?
80-degree weather coming.
Yes. All right. If that is the case, then we would look for a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Everybody be safe and enjoy the weather. Thank you so much.